Time, as we perceive it, is not as linear as we believe. Trauma, fear, and the unknown can warp our sense of reality, making moments stretch endlessly or collapse into fleeting instants. Studies show that the brain, under stress, often creates memories that never existed. But what if these memories aren't fabricated? What if they are borrowed? Welcome back to Shadows of the Mind, Episode 8. Let's explore the fractured fabric of time and fear. Jacob woke with a start, the cold still biting at his skin. Except he wasn't in the mansion. He wasn't even in the snow-covered forest. He was in a small, sterile room. A hospital room, judging by the faint antiseptic smell and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The last thing he remembered was the mirror room, the figures closing in, and the shard's blinding light. He touched his arm, feeling a bandage wrapped tightly around his wrist. A nurse appeared at the door, her expression neutral but distant, as if she'd seen too many patients like him. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "You were found on the outskirts of town, unconscious and hypothermic. No ID, no explanation." Jacob's mind reeled. Town? He'd been miles from civilization, deep in the wilderness. His memories felt fragmented like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. He asked, his voice hoarse, "How long have I been here?" "3 days," the nurse replied without meeting his eyes. She handed him a clipboard with forms to fill out. "The police want to talk to you when you're ready." Elias stood in his apartment staring at the shard on his kitchen counter. He didn't remember how he'd gotten home, but there it was. The faintly glowing shard that now pulsed every so often like it had a life of its own. The apartment felt wrong, too clean, too organized. It wasn't how he'd left it. The twitch in his hand had worsened. Now it spread, his fingers jerking in violent spasms. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized. Haggard, pale, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He ran his hand over his face and checked his phone. The date flashed on the screen. December 26th. His blood ran cold. It had been days since the mansion, but he only remembered flashes. Jacob screaming, the mirrors shattering in that infernal light. A knock on his door startled him. He hesitated before opening it, half expecting a ghost from the mansion to greet him. Instead, a courier handed him a package, a brown box with no return address. Inside was a weathered notebook, its cover stamped with the name of a psychiatric institution, Ravenhurst Asylum. Elias flipped it open, his hand trembling. The first page had one chilling line written in a familiar hand. "What do you fear the most?" Jacob sat in the hospital bed, staring at the newspaper the police officer had handed him. The headline read, "Local man found unconscious near ruins of burned estate." The mansion had burned to the ground decades ago, the article claimed, a mysterious fire that left no survivors. But Jacob had been inside it. He remembered the frost-covered walls, the mirrors, the unbearable cold. How could it be gone? The officer, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, leaned against the doorframe. "Care to explain what you were doing there? The place is condemned." Jacob tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain something even he didn't understand? He muttered, "I don't know." Elias sat at his desk, the notebook open before him. The pages were filled with accounts of patients at Ravenhurst Asylum, each one describing vivid hallucinations, unexplainable gaps in time, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One patient, known only as Subject X, claimed to have seen a mansion in the snow, its mirrors reflecting impossible truths. The shard on the desk pulsed in response, its glow casting eerie shadows. Elias clenched his twitching hand, anger bubbling beneath his fear. "What do you want from me?" he growled at the shard. The glow flickered, almost as if it were laughing. Jacob lay in the dark, staring at the cracks in the hospital room's ceiling. Sleep evaded him, his mind a turbulent sea of fragmented memories and unanswered questions. The mansion, the shard, the reflections. It all felt like a terrible dream. Yet the coldness lingering in his bones told him otherwise. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp noise like glass scraping against metal. He froze, his breath hitching. The sound came again, this time closer, a deliberate, rhythmic scratching. He sat up, the thin hospital blanket slipping off his shoulders. His eyes darted to the window. Frost had formed along its edges, spreading unnaturally fast. The frost crept inward, forming jagged, intricate patterns that looked almost like runes. Jacob's pulse quickened as the patterns began to shift, rearranging themselves. Letters, words, a message. He climbed out of bed, his legs trembling, and approached the window cautiously. His breath fogged the glass as he read the message etched into the frost. Leave. Jacob stumbled back, nearly tripping over the IV stand. The word began to fade as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a dark shadow on the other side of the glass. It wasn't his reflection. It was something else entirely. The shadow tilted its head, watching him. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and Jacob's chest tightened as an overwhelming sense of dread consumed him. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The shadow leaned closer, its mouth parting in a smile that stretched too wide. Then it whispered, "Run." The lights in the room flickered, then went out entirely, plunging everything into darkness. The frost-covered message on the hospital window haunted Jacob, its final word. Run. Replaying in his mind like a broken record. He hadn't told the officer about it. Who would believe him? Now he sat alone in the waiting room, his hands gripping the armrests of the uncomfortable chair. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above only added to his sense of disorientation. The air was colder than it should have been, and Jacob felt it settle in his chest like a warning. His reflection in the window across from him wasn't moving. Again. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. His reflection was staring straight ahead, unblinking while he shifted uneasily in his seat. The door opened, breaking the spell. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter, you're free to go. Police have dropped their hold for now." Jacob nodded absently and stood, but the window's reflection lingered in his peripheral vision, distorted and unnatural. Elias was still staring at the shard when his phone rang. The sound was jarring, almost out of place in the oppressive silence of his apartment. He picked it up, expecting an anonymous number. He hadn't spoken to anyone since returning. The screen was blank. "Hello?" he said cautiously. A long pause. Then a faint voice came through, distorted like a poor signal. "It's still watching?" Elias gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice wavered, almost childlike in its tone. "Don't follow the frost." The call ended abruptly. Elias stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He checked the call log, but there was no record of the call ever happening. The shard on his desk pulsed faintly, as though mocking him. Jacob was walking aimlessly, the cold biting through his thin coat. He couldn't go back to the hospital, and the police station felt like a trap. As he turned down an empty street, he saw a figure in the distance, standing still under a flickering street lamp. It was Elias. Jacob stopped, a mixture of relief and dread washing over him. He didn't call out. Something about Elias's posture, stiff and unnatural, kept him silent. Instead, he approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Elias turned sharply, his eyes wide and hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked at Jacob as if he had been expecting him. "You're alive," Elias said flatly. "Barely," Jacob replied, his voice heavy. He glanced around, the empty street feeling too exposed. "We need to talk, somewhere safe." Elias smirked, a bitter edge to his expression. "Safe? There's no such thing anymore." They found themselves in a small diner, the kind that felt timeless, with vinyl booths and warm lighting. The waitress barely glanced at them as they sat in the corner. Jacob leaned forward, his voice low. "Something's wrong. I saw it again in the window. It was watching me." Elias didn't flinch. "It's always watching, and it's not going to stop." Jacob hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "What's it waiting for? What does it want?" Elias reached into his pocket and placed the shard on the table, its faint glow casting long, flickering shadows. "This is a piece of something bigger, and I think it's waiting for us to find the rest." Jacob stared at the shard, the unease in his chest growing. "How can you be so sure?" Elias tapped the notebook he'd brought, its cover worn and faded. "This says there are more. Other shards. Other pieces. If we don't find them, I don't think we'll make it." Jacob's gaze shifted to the shard, the glow hypnotic. He felt the same pull he had in the mansion, like it was calling to him. "And if we do find them?" Elias's expression darkened. "Then maybe we'll figure out what the Watcher really wants." After leaving the diner, they walked in silence, their breath visible in the icy air. The streets were eerily quiet, the city seeming to hold its breath. Elias's hand twitched sporadically, the motion sharper now, almost violent. "You're twitching worse," Jacob said, breaking the silence. "You need to see someone about that." Elias didn't look at him. "There's no one who can fix this." As they turned a corner, they both stopped abruptly. The frost had returned, spreading across the pavement in intricate web-like patterns. It led into an alley where faint whispers echoed. Jacob swallowed hard. "Do we follow it?" Elias clenched his jaw, his hand twitching uncontrollably now. "We don't have a choice." They stepped into the alley, the frost crunching beneath their boots. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a haunting cacophony. At the end of the alley stood a door, its surface coated in ice. As they approached, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic pounding from behind the door. Elias reached for the handle, his hand trembling. He hesitated, then looked back at Jacob. "You ready?" Jacob shook his head. "Not even close." The door creaked open. Inside, the space was wrong. The walls seemed too close together, the ceiling impossibly high. Frost clung to every surface, the air colder than outside. In the center of the room was a mirror, larger than any they'd seen before, its surface black and shimmering like liquid. The shard in Elias's pocket vibrated violently, almost as if it were reacting to the mirror. He pulled it out, and the glow intensified, casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. The mirror rippled, and a figure began to emerge. It wasn't the Watcher, not exactly. This figure was taller, its features indistinct, its form composed of frost and shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing its own existence. Jacob backed away, his breath fogging the air. "What is that?" The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes fixing on the shard in Elias's hand. When it spoke, its voice was a deep, resonant echo that seemed to fill the room. "You carry the key," it said, "but you are not its master." Elias tightened his grip on the shard. "What do you want from us?" The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "To understand fear, you must embrace it. Only then will the path be revealed." The walls began to crack, the frost spreading rapidly. The figures formed dissolved into a swirling storm of ice and shadow, the room collapsing around them. Jacob and Elias stumbled back into the alley, the door slamming shut behind them. They gasped for breath, the shard's glow fading to a faint pulse. Jacob looked at Elias, his voice shaking. "We're not ready for this." Elias nodded grimly. "But it's coming for us anyway." As they walked away, the frost began to creep back, covering the door and erasing any trace of what had happened. Fear evolves. It transforms. And for Jacob and Elias, the mysteries surrounding the Watcher have only just begun. Thank you for watching this far into our series, and if you're enjoying Shadows of the Mind, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. In the next episode, we'll unravel more of the terrifying truths behind the Shard's origin and the Watcher's ultimate purpose. Don't miss it.